Well, it might be the final day of the Premier League season as I'm recording this. However, we've got one team that we've been known for a while is coming back to the Championship, and today they've put a new manager in charge on a 3-year deal. I'm, of course, talking about Southampton, and Will Still returns to his native England with a pretty big job on his hands and a tough task to turn the fortunes round of Southampton after a dismal relegation from the Premier League this season. They just about avoided the embarrassment of Derby's points record, but now they've got a massive job to do under Will Still to get themselves back at the top end of the table and fighting for a return to the Premier League next season. We're going to do what we normally do in these manager specials. We're going to have a talk about the old man and probably the season in whole, because when we were last covering Southampton regularly up to a year ago when they got promoted, it was Russell Martin. We've, of course, had an Ivan Juric spell as well. And now we've got to talk about Will Still too. So the old, the new, and what might change at Southampton. Hopefully you're looking forward to that. If you're a Southampton fan, get your thoughts on this appointment down in the comments below. Of course, a manager who is not proven at Championship level or in English football. However, someone who there's been a lot of talk about over recent times and has gained experience across Europe, particularly in Belgium and France at a young age. So before we go and move on to the new man, let's have a little talk about what's happened to Southampton generally since we were covering them in the Championship. Because as we know, last May it was all excitement as Russell Martin took them up in the playoff final against Leeds. A fantastic end to what had been a pretty good season. After early troubles and talk of a sacking, Southampton obviously then went 25 odd unbeaten. They were able to get promoted and they were part of that 14 pack at the top of the table who were absolutely brilliant in the 23-24 campaign. But it immediately became a problem at the start of this season. Of course, we knew that Russell Martin had this set style of football. We knew Southampton perhaps hadn't invested enough to build a strong squad. I think everyone was asking at the start of the season, where are the goals going to come from? And probably bar Aaron Ramsdale, there weren't many established Premier League players coming into that squad, certainly who were not at the peak age and ready to make an impact. So I think a lot of people were expecting a relegation this year, but perhaps not with the level of disappointment that it's come with. In the end, just about pipping Derby's points record with a couple of weeks to go. And as I'm recording this, losing 2-1 to Arsenal on the final day, making it 86 goals conceded at the bottom of the Premier League table. A lack of goal threat has been a real issue, a very different problem to what we saw in the Championship the season before, where actually Southampton were one of the worst defences in the top half, purely because they conceded so many goals early in the campaign where they lost by 5. They had a 4-4 draw in that little spell where Russell Martin was at risk of losing his job. So it's very clear that Southampton have battled between styles, and it's something they've done a lot in recent seasons. We talked about it here on the channel a couple of years ago, the first time they got relegated from the Premier League, when Nathan Jones had a brief spell in charge. We had a little episode talking about that, the fact that they'd gone for a completely different style to the previous manager. They then changed their tune again. They then went for Russell Martin, who, of course, completely different style. And then they did the same again this season. They went for that pragmatic approach. I don't know what they were expecting, because I think a lot of us said it. Look, I'm not the biggest Russell Martin fan in the world. He did a very good job. But the fact of the matter is, there wasn't anyone that was going to keep that Southampton team up. And the question becomes whether there's a point you stick to your principles and prepare for the Championship next season. Because if Southampton had come down with Russell Martin in charge on, say, even 12 to 15 points, then I think they would have been favourites to go back up next season. They'd have had a squad that could have coped with it. But now they've gone through this uncertain period where they tried to change to a more pragmatic style at times under Ivan Juric, and had a couple of decent showings at it. I remember a 0-0 draw early on against Fulham where they were relatively solid, but they were never at any danger of getting out of trouble or even looking like being a threat. And now as we get towards the end of the season, a little spell in interim management where they've tried to sort of cross back towards a slightly different style again. And now they go to Will Still, and there is a little bit of a misconception about the style of management that he's produced and the style of teams he's produced, because he's this young, exciting name being talked about from abroad, and he's got great experience for a young manager. But again, he's certainly not on paper the Russell Martin type. So let's move on to the new man and talk a bit about Will Still. Because of course, we're talking about a 32-year-old English manager who's been away, learning his trade in the likes of Belgium and France over the last 8 years or so. He's obviously had 2 very notable spells where his name's come to fruition in France, because in those periods he picked up a lot of traction, starting at Stade de Rennes with a long unbeaten run, impressive performances tactically against PSG where he picked up a couple of draws, and was record setting when it came to long unbeaten runs at the start of his tenure. And to be honest, for about a year and a half, he had a bit of a dream spell there. But it did finish with disappointment because towards the end, it was becoming a tough time to win a game. I think he won 2 of his last 14, and Stade de Rennes sort of faded towards mid-table at the end of his second year, which is where they were expected to be. But ultimately, after such a positive start, it was disappointing, and his influence did just fade very slightly. We know his brothers are going to come with him, as they did then the following season to Lens, where this year they've had a very good campaign, a 44% win rate. He's got them up to 8th place, but it's not that free-flowing, exuberant football you would expect. He has built a team on a solid defensive base. They've only conceded 39 goals in their 34 matches, a better record than anyone below them in the table, and a couple of the sides above them as well. In fact, the third best record in the division after PSG and Lille. But going forward, very much a different story. Only the bottom 6 have scored less goals than them in Ligue 1 this season. And if you go to his 2 seasons at Stade de Rennes as well, the goal scoring column was in the 40s every time. His teams do not score that many more than one a game and are often built on solid tactical foundations. So I wonder if we look at this one almost as a bit of a Burnley situation where they came up under Vincent Kompany playing this possession based, playing out from the back. Everything must be on the deck. Everything must be from the back to front. And if we get caught, so be it. To a style that, as we've seen at Burnley with Scott Parker last year, is a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit more balanced, and actually is built on a solid base of keeping clean sheets. And then if we can play some great football going forward, brilliant. If not, we'll rely on moments of magic and draws to get us promoted, which, to be fair, Burnley have done incredibly effectively. And I wonder if Southampton are maybe looking at that and thinking, we don't have to go for the same style. We can go for someone who's going to do something slightly different with our team and maybe give us a better chance if we come back up again. Maybe teams are finally starting to look at the possible results rather than just what's happening off the pitch in terms of the brand of football and the style and whether the manager can get a job at Bayern Munich after. So I do find it an interesting appointment rather than one that's going to be an absolute guaranteed success or a disaster. I actually think this is a really intriguing appointment. Of course, not having proven championship experience is the big difference to the comparison I just made to Burnley. However, going into a championship where again some very strong teams have come up, they are going to be one of the favourites. They're going to have parachute payments, and they've still got a pretty good solid championship squad with some players coming back from loan. You would expect them to lose 1 or 2. I wouldn't expect Aaron Ramsdale to be there next year, given how many Premier League clubs need a keeper in that bottom half. But there aren't that many players who you would think based on this season are going to be poached away. Maybe 1 or 2 young stars. Tyler Dibbling gets a lot of talk. And they are going to need to replace that sort of player who can just take the ball and take people on. I'm not going to start using expressions like break the lines all day, don't worry. But for Will Still, the job is monumental because this Southampton team is largely the opposite of everything he built at Lens and Stade de Rennes. And that's probably the reason he's been appointed. Can we see Southampton become a more solid defensive side than they were under Russell Martin when they got promoted and in the Premier League last season? And my God, is the job to improve the goal threat, because while his goal scoring record is not brilliant with those other sides, he was never at a side that were expected to dominate a division. And that applies to his spells also when he was in Belgium too. So it's going to be a slightly different challenge for him. The onus is going to be on winning games pretty much every week in the Championship and scoring goals with a side that this year has had very little, if no goal threat at all. So that is without doubt the biggest job for him and for the recruitment team in the summer, who, to be honest, failed dismally at trying to secure that for the Premier League, difficult as it may be. But the question we always ask at the end of these manager specials is, do we think the manager will see out his contract, and how do we think the club will do next year? Well, to be honest, there's no point talking about the contracts. We say it nearly every time now. Managers seeing out 3-year deals and whatever, it just doesn't happen because the Championship manager lifespan doesn't allow it. I think if he does really well at Southampton, he is the type of name, he is a young manager, he's learning the ropes, he's going to be poached. Or ultimately, he could take Southampton back up, be sacked after 10 games, as Russell Martin was, if they're in and near the bottom 3, which you would expect of any promoted side now. Or alternatively, if he has a tough start in a championship, you wouldn't expect him to stay in a job. So I don't really see a scenario where he sees out the 3 years. Obviously, Southampton aren't having to worry about paying fines for the pro licence being missing, which obviously was a big story about him a couple of years ago. But in terms of whether I think it's the right appointment, it's actually pretty hard to call, I would say. But I think it's a pretty ballsy appointment. And I think it's potentially what Southampton need to produce a side that's a little bit more solid. Coming back into the Championship, I know Company did it with Burnley, and I know Martin did it via the playoffs with Southampton. But there aren't many sides that play that way and just waltz to promotion. And to be fair, even Southampton last time, they didn't waltz to it. They had a good season, but they weren't in the top two. So it does become a very difficult challenge. Most sides that go up are the most solid sides. The best defensive records do generally rise to the top. And I think that's part of what Southampton are looking at. But ultimately, he's going to need recruitment to be good. Interesting that he's named manager rather than head coach. Hopefully, from his point of view, means he will get a say in that. Because I do think this side needs a little bit of surgery in defensive areas. And obviously, finding a goal scorer. Can they keep Ross Stewart fit in a championship? He might be that man having scored today, but that's going to be a question for later down the line. It's not important what I think though, is it? What do you think, Southampton fans? Are you pleased with the appointment of Will Still as your new manager? Do you think he's the right man for the job? Are you looking forward to the new dawn at Southampton? And are you expecting to see a similar style to Russell Martin? Or are you expecting it to be based on Will Still's record at other clubs over the last few years? But as we mentioned, in slightly different circumstances and positions when it comes to being favourites in their division. Let us know what you think of the appointment in the comments below. Get subscribed and turn that notification bell on because there are loads more to come over the next few weeks. Lots of championship vacancies at the minute, and we'll be covering all of them as and when they get filled. We'll also be back in the middle of next week to look ahead to the National League playoff final at Wembley before we return next season for championship score predictions every single match week. Unfortunately, this time not featuring my club Luton Town. Hopefully for Southampton fans, you won't have quite the same problem as we did there. But for now, thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this one, chuck a thumbs up on the video. We'll see you back here again in midweek when we look ahead to another Wembley playoff final. We're 2 for 2 out of outcomes so far. Let's see if we can make it 3 and 4 over the next 7 days. I'll see you there.